Konnichiwa and welcome to episode 15 of the Leadership Japan podcast. And I am your host in Tokyo, Dr. Greg Story, president of Dale Carnegie Training Japan. And much more importantly, you are a student of leadership, highly motivated to be the best in your business field. And today we have an interview with Nick Jones from the In Touch magazine of the Tokyo American Club on the very important subject of employee engagement.
Yeah, so following that, I did a bit of research, and I want to explore a little bit of what you talked about and a bit more. Off the Gallup survey, which was conducted last year of employee satisfaction worldwide, that revealed that overall there were, I suppose, 7% of Japanese workers who were happy, engaged, happy and engaged in their work. Did that figure surprise you?
Well, there's the Gallup poll that I was referring to.
Yes.
Is actually 2009. They did one in 2007, then they did another one in 2009 for Japan. I don't think they've done one since.
Okay.
And we did our own research in 2012-13. So in 2007, it showed 9% of the Japanese were engaged. In 2009, it showed 7% were engaged.
Right.
And that was, as I said, around mid-year 2009. So the Lehman shock was sort of September 15th, 2008. So it hadn't really come to full force by the time they'd done that survey. So I don't know whether our survey in 2012-13, which only showed 2% engaged, was a consequence of real full power of the Lehman shock, the triple whammy of radiation, earthquake, and tsunami, and the effect that had on the economy, and also just the change around people's thinking about lifetime employment and surety of employee has changed quite a bit. So I don't know, and whether it's 2% or 7%, it's not a great percentage anyway.
No.
So was I surprised? The 2% surprised me,
Right.
to be honest. The 7% when I saw it, because I looked at these polls in the past, and having worked in a number of companies where they've done engagement surveys, and then you see your Japan team survey results come back compared to everyone else in the rest of the region, particularly APAC or globally, and Japan's always the outlier. Always the outlier. There's a couple of factors. One, I think, is cultural around Japanese don't tend to be going high on scoring. They tend to be very conservative. So
Right.
if you give them a choice between 1 and 5, which part of the middle of 3 can I plant myself is sort of the idea, right? In fact, I was just doing some executive coaching yesterday for a gentleman for a technology company. He'd just done a 360, and he had his Japanese colleagues scoring him, and it's 3, 3, 3. It was just typical,
Right.
So you've got to look for the microscopic variations amongst the 3 point
Right.
something to try and elucidate something relevant from the scoring. So I think there is a cultural element there, which made it low. But also I think generally it could be that I think, Japan is changing. I think people are becoming a little bit more demanding around their employer. I think that the younger generation particularly, their thoughts on what constitutes employment and the benefits of that to them are quite different. The sort of self-sacrifice element is not there. It's more, what's in it for me is stronger than perhaps in previous generations. Maybe not as much as in the West, but certainly compared to previous generations, there is that element of I really want to know what you're going to do for me. How is this going to help me in my development? How am I going to be treated? Am I being respected? Am I being appreciated enough? Am I being valued enough? And I want that communication. I want to hear it.
Are you inferring then, therefore, for previous generations, if similar surveys had been done, those numbers would have been higher in Japan?
No, I don't think so, particularly. I think probably would have been, if anything, worse, because I think the sort of management mentality was very top-down, dictatorial, barking out orders, snapping to attention or else type of thing. So, one of the difficulties when you start doing things like engagement in Asia is in a lot of Asian countries there's no such word as engagement. Like there's no kanji in Chinese, there's no hanzi in Chinese or kanji in Japanese for the word engagement, you know, or Korean for that matter. You know, it always becomes a phonetic exercise. Engagemento, what the hell does that mean, you know? So the concepts are a little bit different. I mean, I say it to you in English, you get it immediately. You know exactly what I'm talking about. We have trouble translating it. But I think if I go back to your point about previously, I think it was a much more harsh and brutal management system before because, you know, you think about it. As I mentioned, people came out of the war in every country around the world into leadership positions because they'd been the officer corps, either promoted in the field or had gone through officer school of some type. And so they were naturally the people who were chosen to lead because they had leadership experience. But their leadership model was very much military, very much hierarchy. And I don't think there's too many more brutal regimes around military leadership than the Japanese Imperial Army, you know, or all of the imperial forces, not just the army, but all of them. So you had a pretty harsh model to begin with. And I think in the West, we probably dropped that in the 60s, you know, with the Vietnam War particularly, it sort of brought a lot of that into question. And I think people moved on from that and they started to investigate how can we get people motivated and energetic and enthused and moving forward without having this harsh military style model. And how can we actually find the full potential of what they have inside them rather than trying to get just compliance through fear. And so Japan, I don't think, has quite made that break yet. I think they're still locked up into an old model. But it is changing. It is changing. But it's changing perhaps more slowly, and it's sort of still way behind, I think, compared to a Western model.
Well, I suppose you've touched on there China and Korea. I wonder to what degree, looking at the numbers as well, the Gallup poll for China, which were also extremely low, those kind of East Asian Confucian ideals of maybe humility, deference to seniority, those kind of things play into this kind of survey. How much do they affect, do you think?
Well, I don't actually, to be honest, I haven't looked at the surveys for China, so I can't actually speak with any authority about that. And I think China's rather complex employment situation, just the nature of the stage of the economy, moving out of communism. There's state-owned enterprises. There's a lot of things going on there make I think it hard to compare anyway. But coming back to your central point about Confucianism, yeah, I think there is that respect for age, respect for seniority, respect for authority. Yes, know your place. Don't step out of line. Safety in the middle of the herd. There's all of those things which I think culturally are right through Asia, that's true. So yes, I think we do get a difference culturally when we do these surveys. Having said that though, I think what you tend to get as a consequence of that is a lack of innovation. You get more compliance, but you don't get the innovation. For example, my favourite reference point is, you've probably seen this yourself, you know, it's a bitterly cold winter's day and it's sort of sleet coming down and you come out of your subway exit and there's this poor person standing there with an umbrella handing out tissue packs. And they hand out all of the tissue packs, you know. I'm from Australia, right? If it was Australia, those tissue packs would be in the dumpster somewhere and they'd be down the pub where it's nice and warm, you know. But Japan, they're diligent, you know. They are diligent and sincere and they do what they're supposed to do. Great. So at a certain level of service you get, you know, a consistent level of attention to detail, which is good. What you don't get is that little bit of innovation, that little bit of pizzazz that doesn't come across. You think about all of the occasions you go to have a meal here, and you probably, well, in your case, I don't know whether you eat outside or not, but if you go to coffee shops, restaurants, you'll get a level of very common practice, polite service. But you won't get much engagement. You won't get the waitress or the waiter engaging you. Now, if you go to Australia, for example, you have a cup of coffee, they chat with you, they engage with you, you know. It's more than just service, it's a little bit of human interaction to make it a bit more personal. Japan, it's polite but impersonal. Unless you're paying a truckload of money you know, and you've got you know, some sort of relationship with a very high-end restaurant, you know, that type of thing. It's different here. It's sort of polite but impersonal. I think in Australia it can be impolite and sometimes polite and personal. You know, it can,
Right.
There's a more variety there, I think, if I compare that country. In America's a bit different because everyone's looking at their tip. So, you know, it's sort of fake politeness and fake your personal interest, you know.
Right.
Can't believe it's hard to often feel this is genuine, you know, and they sort of, the way it comes across. Maybe they are, but it's hard to feel that. So I think Japan does have that Confucian element. But generally speaking, I think what we're looking for is something beyond compliance. We're looking for something that, example I gave, that yes, people have their hard skill requirements. You've got to know your job. The attitude, yes, the attitude is important. But the attitude is not just partial engagement. I turn up and do my job and get paid and go home. Or I have that sort of base level of politeness and that's enough. We're looking for more than that. We're looking for that, what we call discretionary effort, that amount of effort I'm not required to make, but I make it beyond what I'm required. I take that little bit of extra. I think about it a little bit more. I show I care because I care more, you know, and to communicate that. And so that discretionary effort is the seed bed for getting innovation. Because, you know, if you don't care, why would you worry about making it better? You know, if you're not really emotionally involved in the process, you just do. This is my world. This is very typical in Japan. This is my world, and I'll work within my world. But don't come and ask me for anything outside my world because I'm not ready to do that. I'm not wanting to do that, and that's not my job.
So what is it that motivates Japanese workers then?
Well, I think it's that sort of base loyalty in the culture. I think that there's also, depending who you're talking about. I mean, when we talk about lifetime employment only ever apply to the upper echelon of very large companies. If you're in a middle or a small sized enterprise, you didn't have lifetime employment. So in a way, we've sort of gotten ourselves tied up with lifetime employment. I worked for 4 years in Osaka when I was living in Kobe, and 90% of the companies in the Kansai are small, medium enterprises, you know. So doubtless you could say, well, 90% of the people down there are not enjoying necessarily guaranteed lifetime employment. So who are we really talking about here? We talk about lifetime employment. It's a small, relatively, population-wise, a smaller group. Having said that, though, I think that there is also in some companies some degree of paternalism too in those smaller companies, which again has a sort of reciprocal loyalty, which I think works. And you probably think back, you know, go back to England. You know, we had this sort of paternal owner of the business, and you know the employees were felt, you know, part of the family, and you know it wasn't very rational and efficient, but everyone sort of liked it, you know. And then we sort of, inverted commas, moved on, and now it's incredibly brutal and efficient, you know. And no more paternal loyalty or reciprocal loyalty. It's a sort of free agent. You know, I mean, that's not necessarily a play that I agree with either, you know. I think that there is a big benefit to having that personalisation of things between the sort of reciprocation of loyalty. So I think in some parts Japan has got some good things there. But I think the problem is, though, you're just not getting enough out of that system anymore. Where you had everyone marching in lockstep, that was fine. But, you know, if you've got the Koreans eating your lunch with a lot of electronic devices these days, you know, Samsung's just killing them, right? The Chinese are making anything you want cheaper. And, you know, we've suddenly got the Japanese charter flights en masse to Myanmar, because Myanmar is going to do it even cheaper than the Chinese, you know, type of thing. So your ability in Japan to manufacture has really got to be in the high value-add areas, because you just can't compete anymore. So if you're going to be in those high value-add areas, that's all going to come out of the brain. It's not going to come out of the brawn, because the brawn can be bought much cheaper somewhere else.
Right.
So if it's going to come out of the brain, then you've got to get people interested in being brainy about things, you know, and being innovative about things, and thinking about the company and how, you know, it can be more competitive, how it can have greater differentiation, better client service or customer service or whatever it might be. You've got to get people's minds around that, as opposed to it's no longer this is just my job. Well, actually, this business is our business, and I've got an incredibly important role here in making sure that I do what I do, but I've also got my thought about the entire picture.
Right.
Now, getting Japanese to think like that is not so easy, I think, because they've been trained to think in very micro terms.
So I wonder then how much of a hurdle it is to change that system, particularly because what you're talking about, maybe the approach and the way of thinking and problem solving, is something which is arguably ingrained from school. That is a long process, and that's a long, I don't want to say brainwashing, but it's certainly of applying people to a particular kind of system.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I noticed with my son, he's graduated from Japanese primary school. Now he's in international school. And I remember when he was in Japanese primary school, he made a really big effort to fit in and to not stick out, not stand out. And I saw that transition because he'd come out of international school into Japanese primary school, so I could see the change. And I thought, okay, I can see where this starts. But I think the real trigger for change is middle management, because if you think about it, middle management absorb direction from above, the why of what we're doing here. Their job is to build people and manage processes. Most of them, though, think their job is to manage processes. Right? So they are locked into a way of managing flow, avoiding mistakes, making deadlines, timelines, that type of thing. What they haven't quite grasped is that they are also a key communicator of the why, and often they're not a communicator of that why. The why sort of stops with them, and those below only get told the what and possibly the how.
Right.
And that's it. So if you're at the bottom, it's a bit like, well, I'm not quite sure why this task is relevant. I don't see why my input in this project has value. And I think there's a huge opportunity to communicate that. So, if you're at the bottom and you get your little engagement survey, through the email, and you're on this URL somewhere pumping in some answers, and you're detached from the major point of the whole exercise because you've never gotten the why, well, maybe you're going to have some answers that reflect that in how you answer, you see. So I think middle management have got it. It's like it's not easy in the sense of, we can just flick a switch here, but relatively, if you can get the middle management to be doing a proper job of building people and managing processes, you can get a big change in the engagement score and the engagement outcomes very quickly, because once you communicate to people that why, and also once you engage the people in how we're going to do it, as opposed to do what I tell you to do. Dale Carnegie had a great saying, people own the world that they help to create. Now, in a lot of Japanese individuals' cases, they're getting received worlds from their superiors. They're not getting any input into creating it. So, very typically, if you ask people for an idea, okay, so they give them an idea, and then the boss, the middle manager says, well, that's a stupid idea, or that's never going to work, or we tried that, or that's ridiculous, right? You're only going to do that once, you just cancel their ticket for life on putting out ideas. And I think people's tickets in Japan have pretty much been cancelled through that experience. And also, the ticket's been cancelled through making mistakes too, because mistakes are viewed very negatively here. They don't necessarily see mistakes in a positive sense. Now, you might be thinking, well, how would you see a mistake in a positive sense? But if you think about it, you and I today, we are the product of our experiences built on our mistakes. Everything we've learned through mistakes, basically. And as long as the mistakes are handled the right way and are not allowed to grow into a disastrous proportion, they can be an important part of the learning process. So again, if your middle management is managing properly, for example, if they're delegating in a way that they're not abandoning. Now, often you get delegation, which is, okay, Nick, here's the project, get on with it. That's it. As opposed to explaining why this is important, looking at how we might approach it, getting your ideas, make sure we're on the same track. Because I might think that you've taken the same view as I would on how this project should go. So it goes from A to B in a straight line. But, mysteriously you decide to zig or zag to the left or right, and you take it to a 45-degree angle somewhere else. Now, if I don't check back with you, at the end of the project, I go, Nick, you've taken this entirely the wrong. This is not what I asked for, Nick. What were you thinking? Now I start to berate you. When really it's my fault, because I should have come back and checked very early. Well, how's it going, Nick? And I realised, no, Nick, you're zagging. We've got to come back here to the middle, zig over here and get back on track, because this is where I needed to go. And get that self-correction going for you, so you've got a clear picture of where you're going. So if that's happening, the mistakes will be small, but they'll be learning experiences, and it's controllable. And I'm not whacking you for making a big mistake.
Right.
So your motivation is still high. You feel you've got control of the project, so your engagement feeling is there. You own that world you're creating. Your opinion on how we could do it is being valued. And again, you feel, yes, I've got some ownership, I've got some skin in the game here. It's not just being told what to do, I actually got command of this. So those things change your engagement outlook. And so when you get the survey and you've got that experience, we're going to answer those questions entirely differently. But it's middle management who are really controlling that through their ability to communicate with people about what's required and how to get them enthused about doing it, and also to get them to be involved, to encourage them to have ideas and to feed into the process. So it's quite dual, but you've really got to change the education for your middle management. And this is, I think, the problem with Japan is that the on-the-job training, the famous or infamous OJT, is a toxic cocktail here, because what you've got is a sort of generation upon generation reproduction of worst practices, not best practices. Because if you trace it back through the the hierarchy and the heredity line there, you're going back to the military model through the high growth of the 60s, shocks, oil shocks in the 70s, recessions, IT revolution. You just trace that line right through. There hasn't been a lot of intervention there around teaching middle management how to be really effective middle managers, actually. Management of process, yes, but not building people in the modern way as opposed to the sort of whip way, And I mean, a great example is sports. I mean, you will recall that you had elite athletes, Olympic, national level athletes being physically beaten by their trainers, by their coaches. Unthinkable in any modern culture. And in my own experience, I've seen it too. I've been doing karate now for 43 years. I started a bit of a gasp when I think, how old does that make me? Old, anyway. 43 years. And I go back and I look at how we were taught karate by our Japanese teachers. And it was brutal. It was brutal. It was a very brutal way of being taught. And Australia got creamed in Olympics in, I think it was, now I'm going to say Toronto, but I might have that wrong. It's, was it?
Montreal.
Montreal, yes, Montreal.
76.
Yes, 76. We got creamed. And the Australian government, because we're such a sporting-oriented nation, we take this sort of stuff pretty seriously, like a national shame, day of shame, everyone, black armband day for Australia. So they pumped a lot of money into sports because they couldn't have that, right? And one of the things they did was they looked at how sports were being coached. And they looked at who was doing the coaching. They found that in a lot of occasions, the coaching levels weren't very good. So they put a lot of effort, and they started to create a coaching accreditation scheme for all sports. So it didn't matter whether you're a dad coaching the under-8 soccer or someone like me teaching a karate class, doesn't matter. Every single coach in the whole country had to go and get accredited. Everybody. You had to go to school. You had to go to the colleges, and you go through a course, and you pass the course, and there were levels of this stuff. So we all, turn up, all these, sports coaches turn up to this stuff. What a revelation. What a revelation. Because for the first time, at least in our karate world, we were confronted with Olympic-style coaching, which wasn't being berated. You know, it wasn't being criticised to
Right.
decalcify your spine type of thing, you know. It was things like, say, for example, you know, say you're doing a particular punch, Nick, you know. In the Japanese model, that's too slow, that's too weak, you know. That's ridiculous. Faster, harder, stronger, you know, do it again. Oh, that's still no good. Instead, you do the technique, and it'd be, Nick, that was very good, the way you got the hip action working there. Now, if we can get you to bend your front knee a little bit, I can see how we can get a little bit more length on that punch. If we do that, it means you can stand a little bit further back from your opponent, out of their range, but you can get them with your range because you've got that extra distance now. Just bend that front knee. Let's try it again. Oh, yes, that's much better now. That's good. How does that feel? Let's keep working on that because do you feel the difference? Yeah, you do. It's an entirely different conversation around what's good, how do we make it better? Now, that good, better concept is a pretty basic concept, but it's probably a fairly new concept of middle management in Japan.
Right.
You know? So we're talking something that basic. And I see it still in sports, and you see it, you know, how sports are being taught. I mean, a lot of Japanese, when we had that case of the basketball suicide, a lot of people said to me, oh, well, you know, that's how I experienced it at high school, and that's just how it is, you know. No, that's not how it is. That is extreme. That someone would kill themselves because they're not wanting to get another 40 slaps in the face from their basketball coach at school, you know?
Right, yeah.
Not normal. And so if you sort of look at all of those sort of cultural elements around how people are coached and their experiences of coaching, how people are taught on-the-job training to be leaders and managers of people, there's a vast gap still, I think, around the educational piece there of what's possible. And I know myself, I was probably, you know, a dreadful karate teacher because I was extremely young and I was gung-ho and I was absorbing this sort of model from the Japanese, so you're sort of very harsh with people. And I think back now and I'm sort of, you know, my God, I'm aghast. You know? I must have been a handful in those days, you know, and I think, but we changed, you know, I mean, you can change. And I think and we know this from our own training, as we teach people and we make them aware of this and we teach them how to model this and we give them practice on doing it, they start to get it. They realise, you know what, I don't have to do it the old way. I can actually encourage people. I can actually absorb the idea of people's ideas and input those into the process. And I don't have to be the font of all wisdom. I can be the builder of people and the manager of processes. So it's doable, and it's not a cultural construct that's impossible here. It's within the culture it can be done.
I wonder, though, to what... I can see the possible resistance from, say, Japanese middle management or senior management for the fact they might say, well, it got us to this point already. We remain the third largest economy in the world.
You paused there, Nick. Starting to wonder if that's stick to number 4.
2 or 3.
Thinking, where are they again? Are they down to number 4 already?
But if we compare, go back to the Gallup numbers, which I was reading about some other nations that came top. And the Japanese might well look at those as well. They go, okay, so Brazil ended up with a number that was 27% of people happy, and they're having problems preparing for a World Cup in 3 months. Panama ended up top at 37. And we're here, and it works. So why should we? They turn around and go, it might, because it's obviously maybe not working there. You have engaged, happy workers, but something's not obviously converting into success, business success. But we have unhappy workers, and we've converted it into global success.
Well, I don't know that too many Japanese people are all that confident about Japan's future. You know, if it's working so well, you'd expect we're going to be confident about the future, but they're not, because they know it's not working well. They know that the model that they had, where you had MITI in those days became METI, you know,
right.
Ministry of Industry, Trade, etc., pumping money into designated target industries and vanquishing companies and industries that weren't competitive, and providing subsidies and providing export funding very cheaply, and bringing to bear the sort of political, economic, governmental wills for Japan's benefit, and having high tariff walls and having exclusionary policies around regulatory barriers to make sure that Japan was well and truly protected, but they could plunder the rest of the world at will.
Right.
Perfect system, right? Nothing wrong with this picture if you're Japanese, but that's not the world as it is anymore.
No.
And they can't get into TTP because they're not going to relent on 215% tariff on rice or whatever it is. You know?
Right.
Excuse me. So they know the world's not working as it was. They know that they have to change. They know that they're under the gun. They know that. I mean, the whole country knows that. So I think it's not a fact of it ain't broke, so we don't have to fix it. It's broken.
But I suppose my point is that the system, whatever it might be, and whether we go back to an imperial militarist system, was still one that achieved great things. And yet, looking at the numbers, if we're talking about engagement and necessarily happiness, that arguably there are parts that are missing from those. If you look at the numbers for Latin America, and Brazil's, I think, number was higher than anywhere in Europe. So there we have people that are perfectly happy. But there are elements that are missing to make that convert into business success. So I suppose necessarily we can then conclude that happiness doesn't necessarily end up in business success.
No, we're not worrying about a happiness index
or engagement or what it might be.
as a happiness index as a correlation with GDP, right?
Right.
But what I think we've got here, you think back, you've got a mobile phone, I suppose?
Yeah.
What are you using?
An iPhone.
iPhone. Why aren't you using iMode?
Why am I not?
Yeah.
Because of the range of functions that I can get with the iPhone.
But iMode was the most sophisticated mobile phone system in the world.
It was. It was for a short time.
It was for a short time. Well, it was for quite a while.
Yeah.
You know, and yet today, who's using iMode? Nobody.
Right.
Now our iPhones are full of Japanese parts, but you know it's basically an assembly model, but the design and the concepts are coming out of the brain, not out of the factory. You see, and so it's a good analogy, I guess, or a metaphor perhaps for Japan's problem. They need to have that design and have that innovative aspect because they can't sustain it just by. iMode should have dominated the world, but it didn't. You know, so there are so many good things in Japan. As I said before, you've got a disciplined workforce. You've got a loyal, relatively speaking, workforce. You've got people who take their work seriously. They can be relied upon. You know, that's a terrific base. You don't get the variety of service levels you might get somewhere else. It's pretty consistent here. But that's just not enough anymore. They've got to be able to take it to another level. They've got to become more competitive. You've got an ageing population here, which has got a declining growth rate, which is forcing Japanese companies to now engage with other parts of the world by locating their businesses there or buying businesses there, because they have to balance the risk. They've got to take an assessment about the future, a shrinking market. They need growth markets. They've got to get out of Japan. So the future for Japan cannot be insular. It can't be a type of reverse Dejima, where the Japanese are all on Dejima and the rest of the world is Japan, you know, the archipelago. It's actually, they've got to be, you know, they've got to be global. And to be global requires another level of sophistication. So, I mean, there are so many things here. It's safer here than Brazil, you know. More reliable. You don't have the disparity of income there. You don't have concentration of wealth in a minuscule number of people. You don't have the racial tensions there. You don't have a whole raft of issues in that particular environment. But the potential of this country is still huge. Now, they might be number 3 and they might slip to number 4 at some point, who knows. It doesn't matter, because ultimately it's a sophisticated culture. It's got tremendous technological capability. It's got a basic education system which is pretty good. It's got potential to do a lot more. I mean, if you could get this another 5 or 10% more creativity, that's all out of your teams across the board in this country. Wow, you know, things would be looking a lot brighter, I think. And I don't know that it's beyond Japan to do it, but it's just, you've got to have a break from the old answers which are no longer working and get into what are the new answers. And certainly we're seeing that as a training company. You know, I never thought that I'd be asked to be training 50-year-olds,
Right.
you know, senior leaders, because what they've found is that they're tapped out. You know, they are just not getting enough out of those people. And what the companies are realising is these 50-year-olds are going to be here till they're 70. So they're saying, well, I've got these guys for another 20 years because we don't have the ability to just replace them. We have to keep them going. But we want more out of these guys. They're mainly they're guys. I say guys, they're mainly guys, right?
Right.
At this point in time. The idea of actually having some women in there is probably coming. But we'll get to that one, I guess, eventually in Japan and tap into that half of the population. But still, that's what they're thinking. So we are doing training. And again, I think the sort of that 50s, 60s bracket is also, I call them the sort of, you know, lost patrol, because when they were younger, they came up, you had the burst of the bubble, and they were in their 30s in those days, and suddenly everything's really gone to the wall here. So marketing budgets get cut, training budgets get cut. Who knows, it's going to go into 3 decades, you know, long. So you think it's going to last a couple of years, and so they don't spend the money for a couple of years. And then these guys don't get trained, and they move up a bit. And so then when the faucet gets turned back on for training monies, it goes to the younger people. So these guys sort of missed out. So you've got a sort of middle management generation who's now become senior management who just missed out. They never got the time and the chance to be challenged by new management ideas. And so they're really a blank there. And this is why we're doing a lot of training of these people. So we're bringing them back to information and concepts and ideas that they should have had probably 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
And so there's that element. But I also think managing the younger generation, they're more idiosyncratic, I think. They're more individual. They're more technology capable. They're better informed. They're more demanding. They're more me, you know. So they're a challenge, you know. When I worked for Shinsei Bank, we had older 50 years generation bank branch leaders, and we had these young grads coming out of universities, the good universities, inverted commas, you know. And you could just see it was oil and water, you know. The older guys, they really thought that tough love was still a viable management tool, you know. Trust me, nobody in the younger generation has got any interest in tough love whatsoever.
Right.
And that's why, you know, until about, well, what is it, maybe, I don't know, is it 10 years ago now? Yeah, maybe nearly 10 years ago now. We didn't have a word, Dai-ni Shinsotsu, the second generation of graduates from university, which means come out at 22, 23, depart your company, you know, 4 or 5 years later and go to another company. We'd never had that. That term itself did not exist. And so that reflects that young people are not putting up with it. You know, they have got a long time frame.
Yeah.
And they're thinking, well, no, this boss is a jerk. This company's a jerk. I'm going to go somewhere where the grass is greener. Well, they might get to the other grass and find it's not particularly greener. And that's life, you know, but they're leaving. They're costing companies a lot of money when they leave. They've got to be replaced. All the investment is walking straight out the door to somebody else. And so all the foreign companies, thank you very much, are hiring these people.
Right.
Because, you know, they've got the environment where they can use that type of talent. So it's expensive for Japanese companies to lose them. So, you know, there are those sorts of issues around, again, middle management. You are the conduit here. You're the lightning rod here for the younger generation, you know, the senior management of the company, getting the why message out there, getting people to be putting in their ideas through their discretionary effort, looking for innovation to get comparative advantage and differentiable advantage over your rivals, etc. Being the core group who will help the company to globalise the business and deal with the international entities which they've now bought or created, you know. So they're a critical group, and yet it's still not being done fast enough, I think, to really capture that.
But you are seeing now the kind of realisation by the senior managers that actually it's time to change, it's time to engage these workers, it's time to do something.
We're seeing more of it. I don't think we're seeing enough of it, frankly. You know, there's still a lot of inertia here. It's not moving as fast as I think Japan needs it to move, quite frankly. Yeah. But we see, probably for us, our critical focus is getting behaviour change. Now, the irony there is that most training doesn't work. Most training does not produce behaviour change. Most training, people come in, do the training, go out, and they go back to their workspace and go back to doing things exactly as they used to do it. They haven't absorbed the training into changing their behaviour pattern. What we focus on is changing that behaviour pattern, because, you know, the same things done in the same way, getting the same result is just not good enough. You know, companies want a better result. Now, a better result is going to require a change. It's either going to be we do something new or we do something old but in a different way. It doesn't matter whether it's either of those. Both represent something new. The problem with new there is it's something involving you stepping out of your comfort zone. And comfort zone is all about reduction of risk. You know, we all find the fastest, cheapest, safest way to work every day. You know, we stand in front of the door where the escalator is right there when the door opens, you know, closest to the exit. We're creatures of habit. We get into our comfort zones. We eat within a half a kilometre radius of our office in the same restaurants all the time that we've tried and we know are good. You know, we have the same group of friends that we're comfortable with, right? The problem is, if you stay in your comfort zone, you're not going to try something new. You're not going to engage with the change. So we have to get people to have the confidence to step out of their comfort zone and take on the new in terms of a new way of doing things or a new way of implementing the task. Once we get people to do that, that's where you get training which has outcomes, because they go back to just doing things in a new way and getting a different result, a better result. The trouble is, even though there's lots of training, most of it doesn't have that element in it. So that's a big gap still. So just, particularly in Japan, I mean, my God, Japanese style of corporate training is just horrendous. It's lecture. It's the sensei, the guru, you know, lecturing, dry, boring, you know, just data download. Everyone's sleeping. They're just dying in their seats, you know. And so
text-heavy PowerPoints.
Oh, my God, you know, yes.
Yeah.
And so what you get there is a nation of corporate warriors trained to be bored to death in the training process. So when you mention the word training to Japanese people, they have a couple of reactions. Their first reaction is, oh, is there some veiled criticism of me in suggesting that I need training? Am I failing in my job? Am I not being properly appraised here about how well I'm doing my task? Is there some hidden agenda to get rid of me? That's their first reaction. Wow. The second reaction is, oh my God, this is going to be droll, boring, dull. It's going to be, you know, watching paint dry is going to be more exciting than this.
Right.
So you can imagine, you know, well, we get them in the classrooms. There's a lot of what we call in the training business hostiles. You know, they've got the arms folded, legs kicked out. Why am I here? I don't want to be here. This is unhelpful. This is not useful. Waste of my time, you know. So we have to turn. We have been doing adult education for a long time. We've been in Japan for more than 50 years, so we know how to turn that around. But my God, it's pretty confronting when you see it, trust me, you know.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a product of middle management, because what happens is, you know, this is the conversation. Nick, training's on in 2 weeks, EHR, they've got the details. That's it. So poor old Nick's going, oh, what's happening?
Right.
Why? What's wrong? You know, as opposed to Nick, you're doing really good job, Nick. We've seen you doing a good job. We recognise that you have got a career here at the top, and we're going to help you to get there. We're going to invest in you. We're going to give you the tools to become even better than you are today. We're bringing in the world-famous Dale Carnegie organisation who runs some training, and you have been one of the few people selected to take part in that. Now, I'm sure there are many areas you'd like to get the maximum benefit in the training from. What are some things you'd like to work on yourself? Oh, yeah, that's good, that's good, that's good. Yes, I see all that, that's great. And by the way, looking from my point of view as your boss, I see a couple of areas here where I think if we worked on these as well, you'd be even better. So let's add those to the list. We'll send this to the trainer. So during the training, they will be trying to help you in these particular areas to be even better than you are today. And by the way, when you come back from training, I want you to tell me how you're going to execute in your job what you've learned. Imagine that conversation compared to Nick, training's on in 2 weeks. See HR for details.
Be there.
So you can imagine if you had that type of middle management setting up of the training, and then you have the debriefing of the training at the end. Wow, what sort of difference is that? You know, and I think that's the missing piece in Japan when you talk about training, because there is a lot of training, but there's not a lot of good training. There's not a lot of training that gets behaviour change. And we know ourselves. It takes 250 hours of training for us to certify a Dale Carnegie trainer. That's a lot of training. It takes about 1.5 years. You've got to be really committed.
Right.
The reason is because we are getting behaviour change. We know how difficult that is to get that behaviour change. And the courses where we really get the behaviour change are very nuanced, like they're 100 years old. And
Right.
you've got this Kaizen idea over 100 years of constant refinement to really understand in adult learners how to get that behaviour change. So we know this is not a simplistic thing. It's so difficult to get. But unless you're getting that, the training does not have any residual effect. And you'll find it yourself. You go and ask people a month after they've had training, what do they remember? And I tell you, the first thing is they're looking at the ceiling, you know, stroking their chin pensively, thinking, yeah, what did I learn? They can't remember because it's gone in one ear and out the other. Because the methodology of instruction was lecture, it was boring, it was just dull, you know, there wasn't the experiential part, there wasn't the self-discovery part, you know, there wasn't the role modelling part, there wasn't the ability to put it into practice immediately to really cement it. All that's missing. So, you know, as a training company, that's where we really try to put the effort, because we know that gets permanent learning. Well, that's what we're going for, behaviour change with permanent learning. So it's not easy to do that. But if you do that, then the benefit is that the training has high value.
In terms of, I suppose, the motivation for Japanese workers, I want to read to you something that I read from another consultant, where they were looking at motivators vis-a-vis money and how much that plays a role, and other motivations. This is Pernille Rudlin of a company called Japan Intercultural Consulting. She said, all people, regardless of nationality, want to feel recognised for making a positive difference in the world through their work. For many Japanese, the traditional way to do this has been through becoming a long-time respected member of a major company. For many Westerners, this route does not exist. So impact on society has to be more visibly rewarded through pay or status. And this was part to do with the argument about very senior management being, particularly in Japan, but other places, being paid more, substantially more than Japanese senior managers. What are your thoughts, though, on that idea?
I think people do want to feel appreciated. They do want to feel recognised for their work. We know that pay alone is not necessarily a big enough motivator. There are certain transactional businesses, traders, etc., where, yes, they don't have to interact with others. They're sole agents almost. At the end of the day, you close the business, you've made money, you've lost money. It's all very, very cut and dried. But that's a very, very, very tiny microcosm of you know, the finance business, and that's a very small portion of any population. For the vast majority of people, it's really, am I sensing and feeling that I'm valued? That's a critical thing. So how do you feel that? And this is, again, it's coming out of your management, coming out of your leadership, and how do they communicate that to you? And it's a bit like if you're married like me and you love your wife, you've got to remember you've got to tell her. You know, of course she knows it, but actually she wants to hear it. You know, so it's the same problem that bosses do appreciate their workers, but they've got to remember to tell them that. And again, this is training. This is pure and simple, getting people to have that awareness that you need to communicate more. And so I don't think these are difficult things to do, but it's if the training isn't there and the awareness is not there, you tend to default to your normal routine, which is assumption that somehow, without communicating it, everyone knows I really care, and without telling anybody that I'm really got their interests as my best in heart, their best interests at heart. That's not the case. You've got to tell them. You've got to communicate. You've got to be constantly getting them involved. So I think the number differentiation between senior leadership in Japan, what they get paid and what they get paid in the West, is just purely a function of the profitability of companies and the individual component in their profitability, where in Japan, because it's more of a group consensus society and a group effort, it's hard to pinpoint an individual who's actually been the key person to get that big outcome. And so it's all sort of sacrifice for the group rather than put yourself forward as the individual, right? And so, I mean, you had that case where the guy actually came up with a particular innovation. It was painted by the company, and he just got paid, peanuts.
Oh yeah, the LED.
Yeah, for the innovation, and then he sued them eventually, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's just a cultural thing, that you work for the company, and yes, of course you innovate, and you'll get paid a lot later when you get to the top. But if you don't get to the top, you don't get paid a lot later, right? So that's how it is. Whereas in Western countries, there's more at risk. Your job is at risk. You've got big bonus, big salary, but you may be out of a job too. Whereas Japan, that's not likely to happen unless you really do something pretty flagrant. So, it's a sort of mediocre, sort of middle-of-the-road type of idea, as opposed to a high-achieving,
Right.
all-in, all-out, high-risk, high-return type of environment. So I think that sort of differentiates the payment side. And again, money's important, but people are looking for more than that.
But do you think those are greater drivers of motivation in the West, as in money and status, position within the company, than maybe they are in Japan?
To a degree, yes, but it's not that dissimilar in that, again, people want to be recognised. They want the money, yes, but they want to have the sense of achievement in their work. They want to have the sense that they're well regarded, bosses recognise them, and are obviously recognised because they've been told. They want all of that, So I think probably the money's probably a bit better, but the risk is higher. But they still want the same things, even though it's not just money. Anyone who thinks money is the only motivator is talking about a very, very tiny, small group of usually extremely well remunerated people.
Right.
Now, if you want to pay your people truckloads of money, go for it. But most companies don't want to do that. They want to pay people a fair wage, fair remuneration for a fair day's work. They can't afford to pay people, voluminous amounts of money. They can only afford to pay a few people that who are bringing in huge amounts of money usually. So it's it goes in step. For the vast majority of people, 99% of people, that's not even an issue.
Right. I suddenly ran a blank there. Where was I going? I was almost down. Oh, that's right. Taking another, I suppose, element of the idea of what you were talking about before, which was about innovating and getting Japan to move ahead with new ideas and being able to, I suppose, take that leap into, I suppose, what might be argued the next generation of the economy. There have been some interesting moves in this area, namely with Rakuten and to a lesser degree with Uniqlo. Rakuten in particular because it's now moved to an all-English environment. And Mikitani has said that one of the motivating reasons for this was because he said he didn't want the language, in this degree, Japanese, to restrict the way that people thought. And he thought that English would enable people to think freer. Do you agree with that concept? And would you support that kind of move to creating what you were talking about, the end goal of more innovative, thought-provoking environments?
Well, Mikitani's success with Rakuten is substantial, but if you go back to when he started, it was all hard slog, and there was no its own English policy then. And so that's something that's evolved as they've had the success. And he's quite smart in thinking global from the very beginning, and he got to a certain size where he could then implement a policy like that. And they are doing things globally. He's seeing the world globally. And so he needs a population of people who are global thinkers and who are able to access information globally, as opposed to what's just coming through a thin filter of translation into Japanese. So I think there probably is some greater freedom when you're in a foreign language. I think Japanese language is rather circuitous compared to English, which is tending to be a bit more direct. There's probably a lot more subtlety in Japanese language and nuance than perhaps there is in English. So it does probably tend to restrict you a little bit. But I think that it's probably great if you can have, people being multilingual or bilingual in a company where it's a global business. I think it's great that even people who are in domestic businesses would have that ability to tap into what is an incredible amount of information availability these days over the internet, just vast. I think that's all positive too. I think the ability to think, though, is not restricted by language. The ability to innovate is not restricted by language. I mean, when we do our own 9-step innovation process training, Japanese come up with great ideas because they're given two things. They're given a tool that allows them to plumb the depths of their own creativity and thinking. And secondly, they're given the freedom to come up with ideas without critique in the first instance. So we have what we call green light, red light thinking. And, De Bono had his 6 thinking hats, and there are numerous ways of looking at this. But it's a similar idea that anybody who's going to have criticism and critique of an idea at the idea generation stage is just put the sword to the idea generation process completely. What you've got to have is freedom to put up your wacky, off-the-wall, bizarre, pointless, hopeless, ridiculous idea. You've got to have the freedom to do that because your wacky, hopeless, ridiculous, crazy idea may be the spark of stimulation for somebody else to come up with something that may be more viable. But if you didn't have that spark, that may not be triggered. So you need to have that freedom, and this is where I think the Japanese system is not particularly good from a managerial point of view to allow that freedom. And so, give me your best ideas, perfectly formulated off the bat, is not a great approach, because the idea generation process, innovation process is messy. It's incredibly irregular. It's something that doesn't go in a direct line. It's all over the shop. That's how it works. So you can't try and, formalize that into some sort of, linear pattern, which is what I think for a lot of Japanese companies and their middle management are trying to do. So I think you give people the right tool and the right freedom and environment, encouragement, and you will get that. And I've seen that. I've done, the last 20 years of running businesses in Japan, I've always done brainstorming, always done idea creation. And I can tell you, in my experience, the Japanese are no less creative than anybody else. Right. It's just a matter of tapping into the reservoir there of ideas that they've got, which they are not usually encouraged to bring out. And you give them the opening, and the floodwaters open up, if I use my reservoir example, and out they come. They're there. And great ideas, brilliant ideas. So it's there.
So looking at the experience you've had in Japan to date, and certainly you said some of the baby steps you're seeing with maybe middle management, plus maybe some of the realisation in the government even, in particular when I think about the Education Ministry, which is pointed the finger at the universities and said, we now need global graduates globalized graduates, and has pointed out 30 particular universities, which they were now willing to stump up the cash to support. Are you optimistic?
I'm shaking my head off mic here because that's a think about it. They had the Yutori Kyoiku, right, the relaxed education, to take out the number of hours of rote learning and introduce some element of more creative, innovative thinking, right? It lasted, about 8-9 years? And because they dropped in the international comparative tables around country positioning and status, they all panicked. Now, rote learning is great when you're in kindergarten and when, you're in primary school, maybe when you're in high school. But, this isn't going to cut it in the real world of business. And so what you've got is a tremendous rote learning platform up to the end of high school. And then you go into university. What happens in university? Well, first of all, the first problem is no one does any study at university of any great consequence or significance. I mean, I graduated from Japanese university, I know. The things that I would have expected were going on there weren't going on there. The rigour of debate that should have been going on there wasn't going on there. The style of lecturing was very one way. It was very, top down. It was very droll. And so they're not really being challenged at university. So this sort of, we're going to make you global and throw money at it. Well, that's fine, go for it. But your real problem is not that. Your real problem is to change the way that people think about problem solving and to get more ideas out and more debate going and more communication going at the tertiary level, because it is not there. I mean, the quality of experience that I had at an Australian university coming through the tutorial system and having to defend a position and promote an idea or an interpretation of something or other, phenomenal. Japanese don't get that. They just don't get that. So, you go to sleep for 4 years and have club activities and socialisation and, drink beer and chase girls or whatever they do, the guys at least anyway. And you come out of it a little bit older but not much smarter.
But do you think the recognition by the government at least is a step now, that they are at this crossroads, that they are now looking, even before the corporate level, that we do need to make changes here for it to follow through into our companies?
Well, there's certainly, I suppose I'm always a bit leery about government solutions from the Ministry of Education, in Japan. I mean, my dealings with them don't give me a great deal of optimism about their ability to direct anything, frankly. Depressing place to visit too. I've got to tell you, if you've ever had the opportunity to visit there. But no. I think, yes, there may be a recognition, but whether there's the actual wherewithal and the smarts to actually make a difference, I have my doubts, quite frankly. I have my doubts. I'm not confident.
Lastly then, how do you expect these figures right now to continue? When we looked at the engagement of workers in Japan, how do you foresee those continuing?
I think it'll stay like it is. I don't see any major rebound in a hurry. It's like everything. There's a certain momentum gets to a point of what's the word I'm struggling for here? Of critical mass is the word I'm struggling for. I'm losing my English after living here all these years. A critical mass where change has to come, and I think not too many economies can have like 3 decades of downturn and decade upon decade of deflation, and still bounce back. But Japan's, I think, coming out of it. I think we're finally making the turn around the corner somewhere, slowly but surely. But it needs to speed up and it needs to go broader and deeper and faster, of course. So I'd really like to encourage Japanese companies to really rethink what they're doing and how they're doing it, and particularly look at their middle management. I mean, if I had one answer for them, I'd say go back and have a look at your middle managers. You might have to write off your seniors. They're beyond the pale.
Right.
No tricks for those old dogs, But at least for your middle managers, inject something into them that's going to have an on-the-job training in the future that's best practice, as opposed to worst practice, and isolate those guys and gals out to be And I say gals there because I want some gals in there too, you know, to be represented in the same numbers, so that you've got a more diverse workforce, you've got a more capable group who can direct the people below and can feed up important ideas and innovations to the top and be that glue that holds the whole thing together, but also be the engine that drives it forward. So I think the opportunity is there. But you've got, you know, it's like the calcification of the spine type of problem here. You know, it's sclerotic right through that management area in Japan. So it's got a long way to go. And until that happens, you're not going to get those engagement scores going anywhere. And that means you're not going to be getting the discretionary effort, you're not going to be getting the innovation, and you're not going to be competitive. You're just going to see a slow burn as we slide, you know, ever so gently downhill into the sludge, the toxic sludge at the bottom, if we're not careful, you know. So let's not do that. Let's reverse gear and drive on up the hill, get away from that.
Greg, thank you very much indeed.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for joining the Leadership Japan podcast. If you would like to access more great insights and information, then go to japan.dalecarnegie.com.